Okay, today we are looking at the Cold War, specifically what happened at the tail end of the war, right after the war, and then kind of the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, and then ultimately how that impacted the culture within the United States itself, along with laws and changes in policies and things like that took place. And that ultimately then gets us to the next level of how that continued to have impact into the 1950s and the suburban housewife and ideal through really the 60s, especially, and of course connecting to things such as the Korean War and Vietnam War as well. All right, so where we're going to start is looking at after the war, of course. Well, I should say, it always likes to do that the first time I draw on it. I'm not sure why. After the war, but also the tail end of the war. Okay, but we'll just stick with after the war for this. But just know that some of this was taking place at the very, very end of the war as well. But one of the things that does happen as the war is coming to an end, and specifically with the bombings of after the use of the atomic bombs, is that President Truman announces that the U.S. is now the most powerful nation in perhaps history. And they had good reason, or he had good reason to feel that way in many cases, because one of the things that happens with this is that the U.S. comes out ahead as, again, the lender nation. So Truman announces this. You come out as a lender nation, but you also come out as the only ones to have used the atomic bombs, and that is a lot of power in of itself. We're going to see that there's going to have consequences that the scientists called would happen, but at that moment, they didn't suspect that the Soviet Union was anywhere close to creating their own, and so you have that supremacy of military power, which there was arguably already a supremacy of military power in many cases without the use of the atomic bombs. And then you have that the U.S. Really prospered with the war. And that was because, as mentioned, just like with World War I, you are a lender nation who ended up making money from the war. And in a couple of ways. So one of the ways was the fact that you now had countries that owed you money. But the other way had to do with production. And the fact that not only was World War II based on production and how much individual nations could produce, and that was clear cut from, I think I mentioned this, but the best example of that had to do with actually when Germany invaded Russia. And Germany had the nicer tanks, for sure. They were probably some of the best constructed tanks, but they were time consuming. And they when they continued to produce them, they made sure that they did all of the components, painting, everything in the way it was supposed to be. So you have this very polished product. The Soviet Union, specifically in Stalingrad, as they were being bombarded, they had citizens in the factory floor putting together these tanks as fast as they possibly could. And they weren't finishing them, just enough to function and rolling them out. And literally, you'd have people finish it to be function. And then someone from the factory line would get into the tank and drive it onto the front lines to use. They outproduced the German soldiers, because as beautiful as the German tanks were, they broke down in the winter and in the long trek into the heart of Russia. And they weren't producing fast enough to replace them, either to, one, provide parts or to replace them altogether. production mattered. The U.S. produced a ton. So that's just a great example from that. But if you're looking at overall, like, so the U.S. produced a ton. That's why you have the rationing. That's why you have the war industry and the propaganda so focused on that, where you didn't have that in World War One because it wasn't the necessity. But you have that shift of an emphasis on production, and that continued after the war. Obviously not within the war industry with the mass production necessarily that way, but the increase in production was significant. So much so that by June of 1945, you have the U.S. had an increase of 65% for production over pre-war levels. Right, and so that then puts the U.S. in this position of economic power, and we're going to see other ways that there's economic power as well, and so you have both this prosperity through production, through military power, and then I put it over there, but we're going to add economic power as its own thing again, because it goes beyond just production, right? This economic power has to do with production, but it also had to do with the final stages of the war. So this is where it's nearing the end of the war that they're coming up with these things, of essentially you got together with the British and the United States, and they created a plan to, and especially the United States, established a plan to make the U.S. the primary post-war global economy. So the whole idea of isolation was out the window at this point, and a shift towards global looking was definitely in play as far as how the United States could function within the larger world. So that was a fundamental shift as well, is that you move from isolation to global interaction and world power and domination, really, in many of those cases. So where this took place is you actually had the meeting of Bretton Woods, which was in 1944. So, right, this is near the ending of the war, but what they do here is that they establish the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund. And the International Monetary Fund was meant to help rebuild war-torn Europe and Asia. And the goal was that, so it did have the goal, of course, of helping rebuild. That was its purpose. But it was going to have the U.S. Would have a lot of control with it. And the benefit of this is that what that allows the United States to do is work, if you go back to production, right? As well as economic funds, of letting the U.S. be able to control and manage a lot of that. And that's going to, it's kind of like both things. It's going to benefit the world, or war-torn Europe and Asia, but it's also going to benefit the United States specifically, and increasing prosperity and production at the same time. What they wanted to do, and their goal with the IMF was to stabilize exchange rates. They also wanted to expand international trade. Again, something that would help the United States with their product and production by being able to extend U.S. trade in that. There was also an attempt in the goal of ultimately deterring currency conflicts and trade wars. In trade wars, the idea being, of course, that it ultimately hurts the economic production and overall benefit of wealth for the United States if you're constantly focused on trade wars instead. And this was also the trade war and currency conflicts were two things that were seen as, here, we'll put this under here real quick, two items that helped lead to World War II. Obviously, that's not the only thing, because there was the ideological component as well as the Treaty of Versailles, but they did play a role. And so the idea was of targeting things that were seen as potential trigger points to conflict and being able to have more say and control over that whole allocation of loans and money. And then this was meant to coincide specifically with the World Bank, right? And the World Bank and IMF would work together. The World Bank would provide the money and loans to help rebuild war-torn areas, and specifically with the United States getting a massive say in the allocation of funds. So it's certainly the U.S. came out of World War II in a really beneficial position. This also, the last thing with Bretton Woods and the World Bank and IMF, is that it was one of several things that we're going to look at. The Potsdam Conference also is going to create this same issue. The Soviet Union was present, so you had the United States, and you had Winston Churchill for the Great Britain, and then you had Stalin for the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was present for this meeting. They weren't excluded from these early meetings. But what we're going to see in each of these cases is that Stalin disagrees with the direction of what pretty much France, Great Britain, and the United States end up wanting to do. And Stalin ultimately refused to ratify the agreement, and basically took himself and the Soviet Union out of it. And the consequence of this, and again, I think reinforced over multiple things. It wasn't just one event of like, oh, Bretton Woods and that's it. It's also going to be the Potsdam Conference. It's also going to be the arms race with the atomic weapons. But you have over time and time again, and the Berlin crisis, where it creates isolation and separation from let's call Western allies, right? The France, Britain, the United States, who end up kind of ideologically being more closely aligned, whereas Stalin moves the Soviet Union to the other side of things and either doesn't agree, refuses to participate, and that each one of those is like a further distancing and creating kind of this ideological belief of the Soviet Union and the U.S. as diametrically opposed and enemies at everything. So one of the things that ends up coming up at the end of the war, and even before, but again also at the end of the war, is the division of Europe, looking at control, treaties, what essentially it's, what are we going to do at the end of the war? In World War I, right, that was the Versailles Treaty. And what they didn't want is they did not want a repeat of the Versailles Treaty. There was recognition by now that the Versailles Treaty and its harsh punitive structure had played a role in creating Hitler and creating the circumstances with Nazi Germany. And so there was an attempt to avoid that path. So what came up with that is the Atlantic Charter. Early on, right, we're going back a little bit in time with that, but that's 1941. And this is looking at trying to agree to first that, and then we'll see Potsdam Conference. Then in both of these cases, there's an attempt to agree that you don't go in the direction of the Versailles Treaty. And so in the Atlantic Charter of 1941, Great Britain and the U.S. said that essentially it was a proclamation that all nations have the right to self-determination. And the importance with this and the idea of self-determination is that they included with this that they renounced essentially claims to territory based on the spoils of war. So this was the idea of old war, that when you went to war, you got whatever land you conquered became yours and you absorbed this. And so here's the thing with this. So Stalin isn't going to agree with this. And technically, Churchill and Roosevelt don't follow this exactly because of what's called spheres of influence. Now, they don't go in and do the more traditional spoils of war, which would be, let's say, physically absorbing territory, right? Where this takes place is going to be the Soviet Union, right? So, and the spheres of influence is going to be the U.S. and Great Britain. So they don't follow it exactly, although I'm sure what they argued was that the spheres of influence was not the same thing as what they meant. That they meant more what the Soviet Union was doing, which is physically absorbing territory. What they did hope with the spheres of influence is that ultimately, through economics, it would help moderate the Soviet Union domination in Eastern Europe. And they felt it was necessary to have spheres of influence with the post-war world to make sure that the spread of communism didn't continue. And when this started, it was less the fear of communism and more the idea of ideology of Nazi beliefs and Hitler's control, or after Hitler's death, just the idea of fascism. But it shifts to the fear of communism. And this is something that's the spheres of influence is going to be something that is a huge part of the Cold War, right? Why it's named the Cold War is because the US and the Soviet Union don't actually physically go to war, but they do have spheres of influence that do actually fight. And they were involved in a lot of political maneuvering and control and manipulation of other countries in order to gain those spheres of influence. So you had so it's a pseudo war. It was a very real war for certain areas that ended up in conflict because of these spheres of influence. But the U.S. and the Soviet Union never directly fought, but it was this constant threat of it elevating from these political maneuverings and use of spheres of influence through economics, through military threat, and propaganda to actual warfare. But that's why it becomes called the Cold War. Not that you, like I said, we actually fought Russia, but you had all those other conditions. So the other part then was the Potsdam Conference. And in this conference, it was set up in 1945 of July, and it was with Stalin, and again Roosevelt, or Truman, and Churchill. And this, again, the whole point was the Atlantic Charter was in place, but Stalin ignored that and ended up with Poland and other smaller territories. So it was clear that he wasn't going to follow at least what they were trying to establish. But their main goal, so there was this discussion about territories and what to do. And they did allow this. Like, it wasn't like they fought for Poland. So I wanted that to be clear with that, is that there was definitely like, we don't want to go to war with Stalin and Russia or the Soviet Union, so what do we allow? And there was accommodations for the U.S. and Great Britain to get spheres of influence in the concessions, then allowed Stalin to annex Poland and some other smaller Baltic areas. The main focus, though, was on Germany's future, right? What to do with Germany. And so you had the three main countries that had been involved in ending the war. What they ultimately decided to do was to divide Germany into 4 occupied zones. And part of the reason that this ends up being what happens is because they couldn't agree on what to do with it. France and here, let's put that in there for that. So France and the Soviet Union wanted more control. And they weren't super big on unification. France, because they had gotten burned twice now, right? The Versailles Treaty also happened with a push because of France, and France fearing Germany, this happening, World War II happening, and also wanting Germany to pay because France took the brunt of things. In World War II, Soviet Union Russia specifically took the brunt of things in many cases, but France would be right up there in terms of occupation, right? France was occupied early on, and they definitely took a brunt of feeling that occupation and control by Germany, which was so reminiscent of World War I for them. So you had the 2 most impacted countries, really, that were not keen on immediate integration, and somewhat understandably, because they were afraid that that would create a resurgence of Nazism and potentially German control. And all they had to do is look back to World War I and how quickly World War II came about. It's exactly what we said we didn't want to happen. And then arguing that, well, you kind of helped create that situation wasn't really going to work. And so instead what they did is they decided to separate it, and with the goal that each nation would temporarily, right? So this was never meant to be a permanent solution, but rather kind of like a cooling down, so that temporarily rule an occupied zone. And then the hope is that they could, especially for between the U.S. and Great Britain, is that they would be able to convince France and the Soviet Union to eventually reintegrate back into a single Germany. And the U.S. was wanting to help Germany reindustrialize and all of that, which of course was the opposite. So you had divided desires, we'll say, right, with industrialization. The goal with the United States was to get Germany back on its feet. So the U.S. wanted industrialization, reindustrialization, right? Because they already had been an industrialized nation. They just were utterly destroyed and decimated by the bombings and the war. And France, but even more so Stalin, absolutely did not want that. He wanted a limit on industrialization, because the argument is that it was industrialization that allowed for that production and attack of World War II. And what's going to happen, and we're going to get into it a little bit more specifically when we talk about the Berlin crisis, but by 1946, the U.S. had begun to withhold, Stalin wanted reparations too. So very similar to some of the Versailles Treaty. But Russia wasn't involved at the end of World War I because they'd pulled out because of the Russian revolutions. So by 1946, the U.S. began to withhold the reparations to the Soviet Union. And this, to the Soviet Union controlled Germany, right? Controlled or occupied Germany. And this is going to lead, along with attempts at unification, is going to lead to the Berlin crisis. So we're going to come back to talking about the Berlin crisis in a minute, but just know that this is the kind of lead up to that. And when France eventually agrees to unify, but Stalin doesn't, the U.S. is going to take this as a sign of communist expansion, and just another example of the dangerous nature of a communist expansion. So what happens after the war too is that you're going to have an increasing, a continually increasing divide and concern between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And what's ultimately going to take place with that is called a policy of containment. And the idea, specifically, the policy of containment is communism, right? Is that's what they're wanting to contain, or the Soviet Union, but all under the guise of communism. And this gets reiterated of just how diametrically opposed the U.S. and Great Britain from the Soviet Union were going to be when you had what became a really famous speech by Winston Churchill that established this idea of the Iron Curtain. And so this was by Winston Churchill. And what he said is that an Iron Curtain has descended across the European continent. And that would be the Soviet Union. And more importantly, within this speech, he said that that the United States was had a responsibility to the future and the alliance with Great Britain to stop the expansion. So this Iron Curtain represented several things. It was, one, the shutting out of the Western nations, blocking out progress, and also something that was impenetrable, and something that could be, the concern was that the Iron Curtain would move as well as the Soviet Union began to expand. So you had this, this leads to the Truman Doctrine and kind of the policy that the United States ends up adapting, is that with Winston Churchill saying the U.S. had a responsibility to the future and stopping Soviet spread. One of the things that comes from this is going to be the Truman Doctrine. And how the Truman Doctrine comes about is one, the speech does, the U.S. wasn't fully convinced at first how serious this was. There was some inconsistency with how we dealt with the Soviet Union at the beginning. But you end up having this very kind of clear-cut, dire message. So one, you have the Iron Curtain speech. Then two, you have a U.S. diplomat to the Soviet Union, right? And he sends back this massively long telegram of 8,000 words, right? Telegrams are not meant to be essays. And it was incredibly long, and it was I guess I should say 8,000 word telegram. From Moscow to the State Department. And it was essentially assessing the current situation and issues that were taking place. And he essentially stated that Soviet fanaticism, basically, was so extreme that it made cooperation impossible, right? Any leftover hopes of negotiating with the Soviet Union, trying to convince them and bring them to the United States and Great Britain's side, it wasn't going to happen. That you had this, and it wasn't just fanaticism. That was part of it by Stalin, perhaps, but also some brainwashing, also some control through, mass murder and sending to the gulags and imprisonment. So, right, this wasn't all willingly, but certainly fanaticism on Stalin's part, for sure. And not only that, so one, cooperation wasn't going to happen, but that the Soviet Union planned to expand. Right, so all those fears of whether or not that you were going to have this aggressive communist expansion, that it was going to happen. And he clearly set up that there were two parts to this. One, it was military based, but it was not that alone. It was spheres of influence. I guess you could put three if we separate this. The spheres of influence and propaganda, which went hand in hand with spheres of influence. But this, especially, is going to create that fear culture. That, there's communists everywhere, that they're out to, spy and get you, because there's even fanaticism. There's so much dedication to communism that, and because they're planning on expanding through propaganda, through infiltration, not just direct military, that anyone could be a communist spy. This isn't the only thing, but it certainly helped play into that. And then his last thing was just that the United States needed to wake up and focus on realism rather than idealism, right? That the realism was there was not going to be a relationship. And not just that, but that you needed to be concerned about Soviet expansion. So Truman finally decided, with the Iron Curtain and the diplomats' warning, that that this needs to be taken more seriously. This gets pushed finally to its breaking point with the Civil War in Greece. And Great Britain had been propping Greece up. Specifically, they had been, because it's a civil war, right? They had been propping up the side that was anti-communist. And this is what the whole Iron Curtain speech was kind of prepping them for in many ways. So Great Britain had been helping them support the Greece in the Greek Civil War, support the anti-communist side through money and physical presence, which was some military support as well. And what happened is in February of 1947, Churchill told Truman that they weren't going to do that anymore. So they basically told Truman they were out. And if they were going to withdraw the aid, they said we couldn't support it anymore. We're going to withdraw our aid and physical presence. And so if the U.S., what he promoted was pushed for U.S. intervention. Basically, please take our spot in this process. And Truman did believe that that there was a serious threat for not only Greece, but also Turkey and the Middle East potentially, with Greece, Turkey, and Middle East. And that there was a serious threat from the Soviet Union. And if they didn't step in and intervene, that they would all fall to communism or be persuaded, right, with those spheres of influence if U.S. did not intervene. So Truman decided to try to get help from Congress for support, because of course support costs money. And what he was told, Truman was told, that the only way Congress would support this is if he scared the hell out of them. That was the word of it. You had to scare the hell out of Congress. Support it. And so the speech was definitely dramatic, as well as somewhat doom and gloom, apocalyptic. The world is ending. There will be no free world if we don't get involved. Basically, what he said with this in his speech to Congress, then, he didn't name the Soviet Union. He said a certain ideology, there needed to be resistance to a certain ideology. And that was intentional to not just name the Soviet Union, but of course expand to communism, and that there needed to be resistance to a certain ideology wherever it appeared in the world, and specifically the preservation of peace and freedom for all of America depended on containing communism. Right, and so basically what he argued was that the United States won't exist if they don't contain communism. The peace and freedom, what it means to be free, what it means to be American, will not exist if we don't actively contain communism. And it did. He basically said how much of a threat it was to the American way of life. And if they did nothing, that American way of life would ultimately be destroyed. And so this got Congress to support funds of, it was like $400 million. It was a lot of money. And it was expensive. This is part of the reason why he had to scare them, for aid to Greece and Turkey. The important thing of what this creates in all of this is that the Truman Doctrine, we'll put it here, of the main takeaway, let's say, of what the Truman Doctrine ends up representing, and how it comes to be used, is that it is now the United States' responsibility to fight communism by any means necessary, whether that's military, economic, ideology, whatever. And more importantly, that they were to protect and help any nation who wanted to fight communism. So where this should seem familiar is essentially the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. These happened because of that ideology, that we had a responsibility to step in and not necessarily be a policing force, but the idea that you have the Korean War and the Vietnam War. They're civil wars. One side's fighting with communist ideology, the other was fighting with a more democratic ideology. The United States steps in and provides aid and support in military, economic, and in other ways to the more democratic side to fight against the communist side. Right, and so that was, and it's interesting, right, that both of those wars had to do with civil wars, right? It's how you got the Korean War is how you got North and South Korea, and both the Korean War and the Vietnam War were not really successful because all it did was split the country into a communist side and a non-communist side, and it ended up being something where many Americans died fighting to try to contain communism and not being super successful at it. After the Vietnam War, this is when the United States starts to question this policy, because the American citizens start to question the policy of why are we fighting these wars? These have nothing to do with us. But ultimately what this did is the Truman Doctrine basically fused anti-communism and internationalism into a policy, so that they were going to you're going to fight and go against anything that was communist, and then internationalism is the idea of butting into other countries' business, essentially, and playing a role into United States foreign policy. That this became our new foreign policy plan in many ways, and again had long-term consequences because of looking at the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Definitely the Truman Doctrine was at play there. The other plan that went with this, and these are often seen as are called two sides of the same coin, was the Marshall Plan. So whereas the Truman Doctrine was kind of doom and gloom, but also, very interventionist. We're going to go in, and by any means necessary, we're going to step up for any society that wants to fight against communism. And not just that we're going to, it is our duty. That I think that's key with it, right? Responsibility or duty to get ourselves involved. Not just that we should, that we have an obligation to go do that. And so it's much more serious, it's much more interventionist, it's much more forward and physical, if you will. The Marshall Plan then was the more, we'll say, positive plan and action. So you have the Truman Doctrine, which is the more negative aspect and the militaristic. And then you have the Marshall Plan, which their main goal was to reduce hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. That was their thing, right? Poverty, desperation, and chaos. And how they were going to do that was through economic and humanitarian aid, right? So they were going to supply goods, medical equipment, food, loans, what was needed specifically to restore the confidence and economic security in European countries. And the purpose for this, it wasn't all altruistic. I'm sure there was a component of that. Security to war-torn European countries. So again, what was the main purpose for this? Is that if they were stable and confident, right, secure, we'll put that, it is confident too, but if they were stable and secure, right, they would not look to communism. And there was a reason for that, of this fear of looking to communism. It was kind of communism was enticing when things were going poorly. In fact, the United States actually had many people who saw communism as a potential option for a better economic security for the United States. And there were plenty of people during the Great Depression that supported or joined groups or subscribed to newsletters that were communist, because it wasn't inherently seen as evil before World War II. It's going to shift into that, to where the United States creates this ideology that communism always equals bad. And that's not exactly the thing. Communism in an idea is not inherently evil. You don't have to agree with all the policies and things like that. What you do see is that the application of communism in nations has not gone well. It's either not possible, or it's very difficult to not have it turn towards oppression of certain groups of people. But in the more Karl Marx aspects of communism, the idea of what it was hoping to accomplish isn't inherently bad. And the United States didn't always think that way. That gets ingrained in us. I mean, if you probably go around and just randomly ask people today, quick, communism, good or bad, they're gonna, if they're American, they're gonna say bad, because that ends up, especially like when we get to the 1950s, but during the Cold War too, but then especially to the 1950s, that gets so hammered in and ingrained in people. It's taught in schools, it's reinforced in policy, communism bad, capitalism good. And so they were fully aware of, even the U.S. past, of people during the Great Depression, when things were not economically stable and things looked really bad, that people turned towards communism as a potential solution. And so they were afraid that these post-war European areas that had declined and had struggles because of the war, and even others that maybe had issues that weren't directly related to the war, that they might be tempted by communism and the propaganda and the ideology of it. And if they were so, then the Soviet Union would be more likely to make them a sphere of influence. But if you provide economic and humanitarian aid, then ultimately, people won't be in a desperate situation to where they look to communism as the solution. And then it was also the idea that they'll come to appreciate and love capitalism and democracy, and then not want to go towards communism, even if they end up in a dire situation again. The other thing that it did is it was a plan to boost a European market for American goods, because a lot of the humanitarian aid and food was made in America. And those who critiqued the Marshall Plan pointed that out and said, hey, this seems like just a ploy to increase the U.S. economy. And it was, but it was not just a ploy to do so. There definitely was a positive aspect. And people, so it increased the amount of goods that were being produced for this. People liked this plan. And it was seen in a very positive light, because it did help people. So, right, it's not all just cynical in the terms of the idea that, right, it was just for American goods and who cares what happens to everyone else. It did provide much needed aid, and there were many people who benefited from it and improved people's lives, or countries' lives, or the people in these countries' lives that we were helping. So let's look at a couple of the images, and then we'll talk about the Berlin crisis. Here you have the Potsdam Conference with, right, Stalin there, Churchill here, Truman there. And this became kind of that famous photo of leaders sitting down and having a conference, but also, of course, somewhat of criticism of them talking about dividing up Germany and Europe without the actual countries being involved in that situation. Here you have Truman giving the speech before Congress. And this, again, was seen as this very serious and dire speech because he was warned that they were only going to help if you scared the crap out of him. He doesn't look... they both look serious, but I guess he accomplished that. He kind of looks freaked. He's reading the speech, and he's definitely looking a little freaked out there, at least in that photo. The Marshall Plan. This was the, well, not really poster. This is what was put on all the goods that were sent out through the Marshall Plan. So, in a sense, it functioned as a poster. I guess they did make some posters of it too. But this was meant to. We wanted to make sure people knew who gave them the stuff, right? For European recovery, supplied by the United States of America. This was definitely. We'll just call it a propaganda poster. Because it was in that, but it was specifically tied to goods from the Marshall Plan, right? So they weren't just passing this around. What you do is when you shipped goods, then this would be there front and center, so everyone knew where it was coming from. And then here you can see it, right, on that. This was the first cargo of the Caribbean sugar shipped under Marshall aid. So they use this as a photo op to showcase there's the sugar, to showcase that they were, what they were providing to people. But yeah, this is what this was attached. This is what it looked like in because it was in color. But with the photo you can't see. This was attached, and not necessarily in this big of a card, because they definitely were using this to promote the first shipments. But that image itself was on the boxes. It was part of the shipment. They wanted to make clear that the U.S. was the one that was responsible for helping out with this. It also looked good for people, for American citizens to see and connect what the Marshall Plan was doing, which again was definitely more of a feel-good kind of program compared to Truman's doctrines. Everything is awful and we're all dying. So the Berlin blockade or crisis came about with those attempts we were talking about earlier, with an attempt to integrate the occupied zones, right? So within a year of the Marshall Plan, the U.S. and Great Britain were looking to integrate the occupied zones back into Germany, into a single Germany, which had been their plan all along, right? But had not been able to do it before. To single Germany. And they established, they did a series of steps. So they created a common currency to help with that, right? So that it wouldn't be separate currencies going on. And then they also moved to have France join with them. They asked Stalin, right, to join as well, and he refused, and instead he ended up halting all traffic, trains and supplies to the western occupied zones of Berlin. So one of the things that was kind of confusing of how this worked, let's go look here, is that you have Berlin. So you have these zones, right? This shows, this is Germany as a whole, and you have the different zones. So they agree that they're going to what's this going to create is that this is how you're going to get West Germany and Eastern Germany. Right, the Soviet Union is going to be Eastern Germany. At first, it was the 4 zones, right? 1, 2, 3. 4. And then with the integration, minus Stalin, you end up with East and West. But in reaction to them starting to do this, what they wanted Stalin to integrate as well. But he refused. And then he halted all trade because Berlin was in the heart of Eastern Germany. And that then got divided, right, into East Berlin and what's going to be, go over here, West Berlin, essentially, with the Western Berlin. And the problem is because, right, everything else is all together, but Berlin is off by itself. So if he cuts off trade into Berlin, the goal was to essentially take the capital. That's what he wanted to do. Is that, fine, you know, you're going to try to integrate, then I'm not going to let you have access to goods into Berlin. That will cut off all the supplies that they need, which will force either a capitulation and integration altogether, or he comes out with Berlin, right? So kind of seen as a win-win. So the Berlin blockade ended up creating both a crisis and opportunity for Truman. And they were certainly not going to lose to Stalin. So with the help from the Royal Air Force, helped the U.S. Airlift supplies to Berlin, because the city, at least the western part, to the western Berlin area, is they wouldn't survive with a cutoff of supplies. Everything, but there was no roads in because it was in the Soviet Union's occupied zone. So the only way to get supplies to the city was by plane, and they airlifted nearly 2 million tons of supplies, which included food, coal, and other medicine and other essentials to West Berliners. And this was in order to make sure that they, you know, because what they didn't want to do is have Berlin fall to the Soviet Union or lose to the Soviet Union as well. They kept around the clock airlifts. Like, this had to go on constantly to not have the city collapse. And this went on for a bit. It wasn't just like a day or two, and then Stalin's like, okay. They had to keep it up until finally, essentially Stalin realized that the Allies weren't going to give up. And probably that the U.S. was not going to. But this was a test. Right, if you're looking for the opportunity part of it, right, this was a test of the Truman Doctrine. Of course, it was with an area that was already controlled by the United States, but it was kind of this early test of Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, because you have the economic aid and also the all means necessary to prevent the spread of communism. And, you know, it worked. In the sense of not having it go to the Soviet Union. So they weren't going to give up, and he ended the blockade. But it was a serious issue that cost a ton of money, and there were lots of concerns logistically. It was a masterpiece of logistics for how they figured this out. And the planes were constantly flying into West Berlin, and just the sight of seeing these planes come in on a regular basis to provide the needs for the West Berliners, who were very concerned that the Soviet Union was going to take them over. And so then what happens is this all merges into the Federal Republic of Germany. So U.S. And Allies side, that becomes, after this crisis ends, the Federal Republic of Germany. And in retaliation, or I suppose recognition that Soviet Union wasn't going to give up, Soviet Union turned their zone into the German Democratic Republic, which is the GDR. And occasionally you can see things that were made from that area, and they'll have stamped made by the made in the GDR. More importantly, it was important enough that you didn't have Berlin fall to the Soviet Union, but what this did is that it convinced 10 European nations that being sided with the United States military might was a positive thing. It showed that, hey, if we were trying to get various European countries to collectively work together and join with the United States. And the Berlin crisis showed what the United States could accomplish, and it also made us look really strong. That we were willing to do all of this. And so what it ultimately led to was that these 10 European nations agreed to join NATO. And NATO was essentially a mutual defense pact. In that, right, if you have a group of countries and one of them gets attacked, then the others are there to prevent and defend. It was also the goal to prevent future war and maintain peace. And one of the ways, right, to do that was right through this defense pact system. But it really was the Berlin blockade and crisis that convinced these 10 European nations to join with the U.S. After this crisis, you really see a rise in what's called atomic diplomacy. And this is in part because of, we'll say, the Berlin blockade led to it was already happening, but led to a clear-cut divide between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And more specifically, the idea of enemies, that we were completely on opposite sides of the spectrum of this, and that we were going to be enemies, and that there was going to be competition and conflict between that. I forgot I wanted to show the rest of the images here. So you have this is them loading up the planes for the airlift. All this flour. Right? That it was just constant loading and dropping supplies. And this was a common scene in West Berlin. And what's interesting, right? You can still see this is all rubble from the war. So Berlin was not in any way, and it's going to take even longer with East Berlin, but neither was West Berlin restored at this point. It takes years to clear out and build back all the destruction, because Berlin, specifically Germany as a whole, but Berlin specifically, was bombed incessantly during World War II. So what's interesting, right, is it's certainly an interesting symbolism of what would have been during the war, planes being this scary, intimidating thing that were bringing destruction. Now planes were bringing salvation. And so you have this, like I said, very interesting dichotomy between destruction and salvation of United States planes flying overhead over Germany and then over Berlin specifically. And you had kids and others and people who came out to watch just this magnificent feat of constant planes coming in to drop supplies, and cheering and celebrating what that meant Okay, so that's for the blockade images for that. So the atomic diplomacy, right? You have this containment policy depended on the ability of the United States to back its commitments by military force. That's part of the problem, maybe also the benefit for the United States, which they showed with the Berlin blockade that they could do. But it's something that becomes an issue of constantly having to manage that is that it required the U.S. to back commitments, not through economic too, but you couldn't just do it all through diplomacy and economics. You had to have a military force to require to protect people, to get involved in wars, and so what this led to, of course, was stockpiling of atomic weapons, which is exactly what the scientists and those unclassified documents that we read were concerned about. And it's going to not just be stockpiling of the United States atomic weapons, but the Soviet Union's going to stockpile, and then you end up with an arms race because of this. And it was significant. You had after 1945, the U.S. began to build up the stockpile, right, and conduct additional tests. So it's not just stockpiling; it was testing and new development as well, because of course then you're always on the search for bigger, better weapons in the process. By the 1950s, the U.S. had a massive stockpile. And this, one of the catch-22s of this is that as other countries become nuclear capable, it creates an anxiety and a continual need to have more and more weapons in order to protect yourself. And the massive stockpile, right, by the 1950s, it was enough destructive power to reproduce all of the destruction of World War II in one single day, which just tells you how many weapons they were doing and stockpiling, right? And this was done. Now it gets more serious in terms of right, that there was this look to the Soviet Union, what was happening. But there was a general belief, even though they had been warned by some scientists, that the Soviet Union was which is a very broad spectrum, by the way, but 3 to 10 years away from their own atomic weapon, which was not the case. They were actually much closer. What's really interesting is they had been declassified and stuff, and there was a book on this, of the conversations and diplomacy that was going on between the Soviet Union and the United States, and Stalin and Truman not wanting to share where they were at with the atomic weapons. And then Truman, right, when the decision to drop the bomb, feeling like he had to share something, but not wanting to give away everything, but believing that Stalin and the Soviet Union didn't have any capabilities, all the while Stalin intentionally leaving out aspects of their advancement because they didn't want to let the U.S. know how far they'd come. And so it's this crazy game of providing some information, having discussions, all the while each side racing to increase more. And so by the end of the 1950s, once they realized realization of the Soviet Union, success or progress works with that, on the atomic weapons, which was a lot further than they had speculated, set off an arms race, right? So once it was out in the open, it was already going on secretly, but it wasn't going on as fast because both were trying to be somewhat secretive about how much they had and all of that. And once it was out in the open, then they just increased their productivity significantly, and also their testing and development. So by the end of the 1950s, both the Soviet Union and the United States were testing hydrogen bombs. And the significance of this is that hydrogen bombs are 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bombs that were used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the states testing. So you think about just how detrimental the atomic bombs were on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then you take something that's 1,000 times as powerful as that, and have multiple bombs. Just it's basically the potential for world annihilation between destruction and radioactivity. And that became the problem, is that it's part of the fear and culture that the atomic diplomacy creates. Let's see, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it creates this culture of fear, because it creates a sense of impending doom. Not just for scientists and the politicians, but for the general public. And that becomes the culture of the Cold War, is this constant fear of the Soviet Union releasing these bombs on the United States. And also the idea, again, of world annihilation, world destruction. Because part of the idea with arms race is that it prevents either side from releasing the bombs, because one side knows that if they shoot off a bomb, an atomic bomb or a hydrogen bomb, let's say the Soviet Union does so in the United States, before they're fully destroyed, is going to retaliate with everything they got. And so it really would be annihilation, self-annihilation, because as they're letting off everything they got, the Soviet Union would respond in kind, and you'd be lucky if you both didn't obliterate each other. And in the process, because of how destructive these bombs are, not just physically, but radiation and poisoning, you end up contaminating how much of the world in the process, let alone destroying and obliterating your countries. And so it's not surprising then that it creates this sense of fear. And this sense of fear then and doom gets put into policies at home, as well as the general culture. One of the things there is the sayings. There were lots of slogans and sayings at the time, but one of them that created more sense of fear really was that communists are everywhere. And there were slogans for, pay attention, be alert, because communists are everywhere. You never know who could be a communist. They're in factories. They're your butcher. Right, they're in shops, street corners, and in private businesses. And this isn't just me listing possible, right? This was said in some form or another. This common fear that these slogans got put out. Communists are everywhere. Be alert. They could be in the factories, your butcher, in shops, in street corners, in private businesses, in the buses, everywhere at any moment. And Americans were warned publicly through ads, through propaganda, that communists at any given moment, right, which is that, again, that they're everywhere, were around you, and you didn't know it, which again reiterates that fear-based culture, right? Oh my gosh, my my spouse could be a communist. No, maybe not that extreme, but really close. My neighbor might be a communist. The person I'm sitting next to on the bus might be a communist. And not just that they're a communist, but that the communists, these secret communists, right, are out to destroy the American way of life, and I guess in connection, you and your family. Right, and that they promoted that. They actually said stuff like this, that they're actively trying to destroy you, the American way of life. So it completely erodes this sense of safety and security. So it's not surprising when we get to the 1950s and the suburban housewife and that ideal, that they were grasping at anything and everything to restore and recreate a sense of security and stability. And that was in the idea of what's the opposite of communism: nuclear families, gender stereotypes, traditional family values and roles, religion, Christian religion. All those things were like check marks to the antithesis of communism. Good, let's force those, let's support those, because if you're those things, then clearly you're not a communist. And it really did it. Being the best suburban housewife, following in conformity in the 1950s, was a way of showing publicly that you weren't a communist. And that's why the beatniks and rebels, the teenagers that wore the leather jackets and rebelled against conformity, were seen with such danger and disdain and dislike in the 1950s. Because it wasn't just a challenge to authority or a challenge to the older generation. Many Americans, because of this fear and anxiety that was being pumped into them, it was almost like a challenge to saying to the American way of life, to capitalism, and saying, I'm okay if this destroys and brings in communism, even though that's not what was going on at all with the beatniks, with the rebels. Those that were pushing back, not even close, but that's how it kind of got took. It's why they were moving away from conformity was looked on so poorly during this period, and why there was so much pressure with the media and in all aspects with the suburban housewife and fitting that ideal. Really so much pressure with conformity as well was because of this fear. So what ends up being created in policy, you have the National Security Act. And the National Security Act expanded powers at home, and was really created based on these fears. So one of the things that it did is it increased the size of the federal government, in part to have more people to fight against communism. It also increased the military and surveillance agencies, like the CIA and FBI. This is definitely a huge period for the CIA, the spies and spooks and stuff like that, because they're gonna be seen as an essential role for preventing communism. It also encouraged new security measures for the United States to be in a perpetual state of readiness or preparedness. Right, the idea that we have to be ready, we have to be prepared for a communist attack at any point. And then it established the Department of Defense. So all things that are still around today and play a role here, right? And the National Security Council. So none of, like I said, these are things that have long-standing implication, because there's still things that are used today and sometimes even get expanded beyond that to this day. From that, the Department of Defense and the National Security Council were the purpose was to coordinate defense policies and advise the president. And the purpose was to streamline it, essentially, and say that we need one group that can create policies and advise the president, rather than having 30 different separate groups. Instead, they all come under the head of an individual. And with the Department of Defense, right, that's where you see the military branches also follow that same policy of falling under a single cabinet level secretary. And then it streamlines response time, policies, and coordination of that. The next thing that then gets established is because national security and surveillance at home increased, so it wasn't just abroad, right, that security and surveillance. You end up having the president sign an executive order that established the loyalty and security program. And this is where you get, and it starts a series of policies that showcase the paranoia of the belief of internal spies coming around. And so the loyalty and security program was so this was signed by executive order by the president, and it was specifically for federal employees. And the idea was that it was they were trying to find communist party members, and specifically spies, really, at the beginning. So whether that was people working for the federal government that were actually communist spies, but it expanded from there. So from looking specifically for party members and spies, then it rotates to looking for anyone who has any sympathy or thoughts, positive thoughts. It wasn't quite the thought police, but about the communists, about communism in general. So at first, right, the argument was, look, we're just trying to root out spies in the federal government. And then it was like, well, maybe we're not looking for spies, but maybe we're looking for people who support the idea of communism. And then it moved to anyone with association. So this becomes the guilt by association. Anyone with association to someone who is communist friendly. So if you are a federal employee and you have a friend or family member who supported communism at some point, or subscribed to a newspaper that had some pro-communist tendencies, then that made you guilty, essentially. And they created loyalty tests for both, this was for both current employees and we'll say new hires, future employees. And what's crazy is that this was insane. And overall, after this was done, 6.6 million people underwent these loyalty and security checks, right? And the loyalty test, we should put, right, security. So that's background checks and things like that. They didn't just check loyalty, it was security. 6.6 million people underwent these tests and checks. And from that insane number, right, you ended up with about 500 government workers that were fired. Again, some of it being as simple as a guilt by association. And you had around, they believe around 6,000 or more that chose to resign. So whether they quit, we'll keep it with chose to resign. Whether they quit because in protest, which for some people it was, or whether it was because they quit because they feared getting fired, right? In any of that could play a role in those numbers. And again, it could be any suspicion of guilt or association, did not require proof of disloyalty. Just the mere hint of it was all that was needed. And then it added specifically targeted homosexuals as potential security risks as well, just based on sexual orientation alone. Right, there was no reason for it. And so anyone that was outed or believed to be gay was seen as a security risk and fired if they are part of the federal government. This eventually spread to teachers as well. So it started the federal government, and then it spread in phases, we'll say. So then it went to state and local governments, where they began to enact these policies. And from the state and local aspects, then it moved to teachers and educators, who were required to also sign a loyalty act, as well as agree to what type of things they taught. And then finally it spread to private businesses as well. So this should seem familiar. We saw this right in the Great Depression, when it was a question of should women work, and the federal government said if there were a married couple, only one of them could be working. And of course, mostly women were the ones that then stopped working. And then this spread to private businesses with that policy, and then eventually it spread to the idea of women not working, married women not working at all. And then what's crazy with this is that they were super vindictive. You had lists of what they called subversive people, and potentially subversives is what they called it, were published publicly. And this, and there was no investigation, there was no burden of proof, and this ruined people's careers, right? Just with the hint of being connected to this could end up ruining careers. And it also led to destruction of other groups and organizations, right? What you end up having with this is this Attorney General's list essentially outlawed. It moved from the list of ruining careers to actually outline specific organizations. And so you had, and again, no actual requirement needed based on just, discussions with people in these loyalty tested interviews. And it's stigma. So whether it was unofficial, where people stopped attending these businesses or associations, or whether you had more physical, actual shutdowns of organizations. And it was against these groups and organizations that had done nothing illegal technically, and nothing wrong at all. So you had, of course, political organizations and social that were targeted. You also had churches. You had civil rights groups. And there was musical groups, which, right, it's like, what? There's going to be an emphasis on Hollywood and directors as well. But yeah, there were musical groups that were targeted, that traveled to various places, and based on where they went, the lyrics of the song. There were certain summer camps that were put on this list, and then it's also going to go to Hollywood directors, and we'll see they're going to get targeted in a more specific thing. So Hollywood actors and directors. And all of this could, like I said, ruin your career, and really blacklist you from stuff. So it's a pretty serious aspect. And then what this led to, based on these loyalty tests and interviews and things like that, was what the shorthand is HWAC, or the House Committee for on un-American activities. All right, and this, what was important with this is that this became a standing committee in Congress. And that's important because what they were given the power to do was to, they ended up getting the subpoena power to subpoena witnesses to testify in front of a panel, and these in Congress, and these were not only hostile, but were often public and televised. So again, talk about destroying people. I mean, the idea was it was supposed to root out people, but it just was ultimately a destructive component of it. And if you did not comply, did not comply to the subpoena, you could be put in jail. Or not just the subpoena, but also if you showed up and refused to answer questions, there were people that were jailed for that as well, for violating the subpoena or being hostile, unfriendly witnesses. And if you were labeled an unfriendly witness, like I said, you were given prison sentences as well. That was for the unfriendly witnesses, was for people who refused to, so they'd show up, but then they would refuse to actually testify once there. So that jail, potentially. And if you refuse to name names, and like I said, this led to blacklisting of especially like Hollywood studios was probably the most publicized cases, studios and execs, in part because they kind of began to stand up for it. But of course, it was also Hollywood, and it was well known, right? But people lost job, friends, and livelihood. Right? This was horribly destructive to people. It utterly destroyed them. From there, we have the spy cases I want to look at, and then McCarthy. So this led to, from, all of this was in this idea of searching out spies for the Soviet Union. You have two big ones that came into this and that were called before the House of Committee of Un-American Activity, and because they were given names and stuff like that. And there's two big cases that played out in the media and that were arrested and or executed. The first was Alger Hiss. All right, Alger Hiss, he was a Times Magazine editor. Right, and he was called before the committee to testify, based on, of course, his name being named by someone else who had been there. Chambers, sorry. Alger Hiss wasn't the the Times Magazine editor. The Times Magazine editor named Alger Hiss when he was called. And that was common too. Chambers was his name. That was common too, is that you had those like newspaper editors, magazine editors, and things like that. So Chambers, the Times Magazine editor, named Alger Hiss in the Hawk meeting, and then Hawk called him forward, Alger Hiss forward, which he denied the charges and actually sued Chambers for slander. Because, of course, again, right, this can ultimately destroy you. This was in 1948 that it was taking place. So then when he gets sued, Chambers reveals that, and this became the Pumpkin Papers, that Alger Hiss had passed on secret films of secret documents. Passed on films of secret documents in a hollowed out pumpkin. Right, and so the term became the Pumpkin Papers, even though it was technically on film. And that this was put into like the farm. And then he said that he passed them these secret documents to go to the Soviet Union, right? So Chambers was supposed to deliver these to the Soviet Union. And he used this as proof that he wasn't slandering him, and essentially that this was treasonable action. So what happens from this is that he had been asked if he knew Chambers in the when he was called in front of the committee of Congress, and he said he didn't. What they couldn't do is they couldn't charge him with espionage because it had run out of the statute of limitations. Otherwise, he probably would have been charged with espionage. And so instead, he was charged and found guilty of perjury to Congress, right? Because if you're subpoenaed to Congress, lying to Congress can be a crime. And so he was charged with perjury for saying he didn't know Chambers. And from this, he received a 5-year prison term. And although he he only spent 2 years, was let go after 2 years. He maintained his innocence the whole time. He never, said that he was a spy, or that, he had done this and stuff. And to his death, he never claimed. He maintained his innocence throughout his entire life. What's crazy with this is, besides the weird pumpkin paper thing, is that there wasn't any proof for it. You had Chambers saying that this was done, but there was no way to prove it. But proof didn't matter, because a lot of this was based on hysteria and fear. Now, the even more known and famous case was Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were a married couple, and they also are going to end up being charged with treason. The Julius was a government engineer, or had been a former government engineer for Julius, and his wife, she was just accused with him. So they were both accused of giving atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, right? Being an engineer, and in the government, I guess. He wasn't on, I don't think, the actual atomic bomb stuff, but that he had access to files, and that they had given these secret files during World War II. Right, so it wasn't current, but it was claiming that during World War II, they had secreted away, and I think this was used as the argument for why the Soviet Union was able to, they were so far advanced in their atomic weapons, further than what the government had thought, even though scientists had warned them that they were further along. They used this as an excuse, like, Soviet Union wouldn't be where they are today with the development of atomic weapons if you hadn't been traitors who gave them information and plans and blueprints and all of that. The government ultimately had a weak case against Ethel. Really, they didn't have anything that was going to stick, and they knew it. And they really, if they were following procedure, right, they should have let her go, because they did not have enough to charge her. Here, let's write that, talking and writing, case against Ethel. So what they did is that they hoped to use her as leverage against her husband. Right, and that way, what they wanted him to do was confess. And so they thought that if they used and threatened her freedom, being in jail, potentially being charged with treason, that Julius would confess. And almost the entire case actually depended on testimony of their alleged accomplices. But the problem with this was, again, there was no proof that they were accomplices. Accomplices. And the accomplices were coached by they were secretly coached by the FBI on what to say. So the whole case was messed up in that, and they both claimed innocence as well. And there should have been enough during a trial for this never to have continued, because you didn't have solid proof. It was entirely based on a word of mouth of testimony by supposed accomplices that were coached by the FBI. The problem was, ultimately, in March of 1951, they were found guilty. And this, in part, probably had a role with the media, which they were showed no mercy. They were deemed to be guilty from the start. They weren't guilty from that. They were made to appear guilty from the start. Essentially, they were judged as soon as it was announced. Right, and so you had a lot of bias in the case, evidence that shouldn't have counted for anything. The American press didn't show sympathy towards them at all. There was large protest when their sentence was established. They were sentenced to be executed for treason by the electric chair. And I think many people thought, okay, well, they should, probably the trial, the fear-mongering. It was comforting to see the idea that there were spies that were caught. The problem with this, of course, is that there wasn't a lot of evidence, and there was protest over death sentence. Many thought that went too far. That's what's crazy, right? That people weren't executed for treason, so that felt like it was taking it too far. And there was evidence that proved Ethel's innocence in the 1990s. Along with that Julius may have been involved in stuff, but they basically just executed Ethel because they didn't want to admit that they were just using her for leverage. So they intentionally executed an innocent woman. Although I'm sure they just argued guilt by association. Or, well, we may not have found anything, but she has to have known what her husband was up to. But they didn't even have enough for her husband. And so this is what the fear-mongering created with the Cold War. Was this constant fear and willingness to not follow the rule of law, to blacklist people, to fire people, to destroy their lives, all on this kind of witch hunt for communist. And this, I think, best culminates with Joseph McCarthy. I think we're on F here. And what becomes McCarthyism after his name, and really part of that Red Scare. Well, let's look at this. You did have people that protest the committee. It wasn't all full support. Right here you can see free speech. Now, Dr. Lewis, for this committee should be abolished. The right to disagree. So there definitely was arguments that this committee was not legal and violated the American rights. So as much as there was fear, as much as there was issues, there were people that pushed back. On the other hand, you also had people like Joseph McCarthy, who stoked that fear and also encouraged the statement, better dead than red. And the idea that to be communist was so absolutely horrible. It was you'd rather be dead than become a communist. So he was a junior senator and not well known when all of this started. And there's questions about whether it was just ambition or true belief. Or whatever. But ultimately, in 1950, he announced that the United States had been sold out by traitorous actions of important men in the federal government. by what he called traitorous actions by men in the federal government. So this is where his fear, why this became such a thing, is that he basically said that that whole loyalty test, all that was going on with this, he played on that. And what he said is that he had, that this was a whole conspiracy, right, which that fit into that fear of that. And there was this conspiracy of 205, what he called card-carrying communists. So that meant they were like official, of the party, in the State Department, which would be a big deal if that was actually true. Again, and not just being having communist sympathies or thinking that communism wasn't inherently evil is different than what the card-carrying communists were. Card-carrying communists were implying that they were Soviet spies or had Soviet sympathies, that they were identified as with the Communist Party. So not that they just thought, well, I could see why communism isn't a bad thing or how it might be applied in the U.S. Card-carrying communists were meant to imply pro-Soviet Union, to full-fledged communist member, which would also be pro-Soviet Union, to spy. So it ranged in all of that. And so, this created a wildfire of news reports, of interest, because to accuse and say, I have a list of 205 card-carrying communists that are working in the State Department. They're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And the public just ate this up. But he refused to name names. To name anyone. So he's sitting there threatening, saying, I have all these names of card-carrying communists that conspired against the government and worked in the State Department. And he refused to reveal anyone because he didn't have anyone. So again, it's like, what was the purpose? To move up politically, to target specific people. And what he ended up doing is he started attacking anyone who challenged him. And this was serious. Why this mattered, right, is because in this culture of fear, we've already seen with these other documents and examples, right, that could lead to termination of job, just by the accusation from Joseph McCarthy, who then became this well-known person that people took seriously for quite some time. It could termination of job. It could create exile and shunning, let's call it, right? Where you lose your community, you lose your livelihood, your housing. And he specifically attacked anyone who questioned him. And later investigations did not uncover anyone working in the State Department. But he had hearings with Congress. He went on TV shows. He talked to reporters. He created this, again, it was that the catchphrase, better dead than red, came about with a connection to McCarthy. He was rude, he was forward, he was brash, he was not a good person. And again, just actively accused people. The one clip that I provided was when he was in the hearing in Congress, and one of the congressmen is like, dude, if you have these names, why are you not giving them to the authorities so we can find them and get them out? You're holding on to these names, claiming you have these names, and he used it to get to be head of an investigation and part of a committee. So that's where maybe the suggestion was he liked the power. He wanted to move up. This was a way to get on head of a committee, and then he liked the attention. He got to go on so many news shows and talk to so many journalists. His name was everywhere, and that's the only thing that makes sense, is that he just got a trip out of this power tripping and wanted to be more powerful in Congress than he was, and this was his way of doing it. But he's in this hearing where they're like, you have to turn over the names if you have them, and it's funny, as the names started to decline, right? So it's 205, it was 95, right? It's 60. But they're like, if this really is true, why are you not giving them to the authorities so that we can get them out? You're letting them stay in these positions in the government, which is dangerous. And so his response back after getting attacked was to tell that congressman, okay, you want a name? And the name he said publicly that was televised was the aide of that congressman, which he said, and your aide who has had access to these important files, and classified files, and your own aide is a communist. And then the guy responds, have you no decency? This is the beginning of McCarthy's downfall, because the public saw this and realized that he was just spiteful and attacking people. He's like, he wasn't on there. You just said his name because you were trying to deflect, and he didn't like that the congressman was challenging him. So he tried to come up with a way to hurt him by specifically targeting his aide. And this is what he did. He did it with a journalist too. So I want to show you, this was with a journalist, Edward Murrow, who interviewed Joseph McCarthy. And then Joseph McCarthy didn't like what he wrote. So then he accused Edward of being a communist as well. This was his shtick. This is what he did. And for some reason, he became popular and powerful for a short period of time because of this culture of fear in the United States. So I like this, guys. This is the journalist. This is his response. And this was also another clip that showed that people saw, and it began to discredit McCarthy. So this was like the kind of perfect response to that, because he was a well-known journalist.
Since he made no reference to any statements that fact that we made, we must conclude that he found no errors of fact. He proved again that anyone who exposes him, anyone who does not share his hysterical disregard for decency and human dignity and the rights guaranteed by the Constitution, must be either a communist or a fellow traveler. I fully expected this treatment. The senator added this reporter's name to a long list of individuals and institutions he has accused of serving the communist cause. His proposition is very simple. Anyone who criticizes or opposes McCarthy's methods must be a communist. And if that be true, there are an awful lot of communists in this country. For the record, let's consider briefly some of the senator's charges. He claimed, but offered no proof, that I had been a member of the Industrial Workers of the World. That is false. I was never a member of the IWW, never applied for membership. Men that I worked with in the Pacific Northwest and Western Washington and logging camps will attest that I never had any affiliation or affinity with that organization. The senator charged that Professor Harold Lasky, a British scholar and politician, dedicated a book to me. That's true. He is dead. He was a socialist. I am not. He was one of those civilized individuals who did not insist upon agreement with his political principles as a precondition for conversation or friendship. I did not agree with his political ideas. Lasky, as he makes clear in the introduction, dedicated the book to me not because of political agreement, but because he held my wartime broadcast from London in high regard. And the dedication so reads. Senator McCarthy's principal attack on me was an attack on the Institute of International Education, of which I was assistant director and am now a trustee, together with such people as John Foster Dulles, Milton Eisenhower, Ralph J. Bunce, Virginia Gildersleeve, Philip Reed, to name just a few. That institute sponsored, acted as the registering agent for summer schools in foreign countries, including England, France, and Germany, and one in the Soviet Union in 1934. It has arranged in all some 30,000 exchanges of students and professors between the United States and over 50 foreign countries. The man primarily responsible for starting this institute was Nicholas Murray Butler in 1919. Its work has been praised as recently as 1948 by President Eisenhower. It has been denounced by the Soviet press and radio as a center of international propaganda for American reaction. and I have been labeled by them as a reactionary radio commentator. The senator alleged that we were doing the work of the Russian secret police, training spies. We were, in fact, conducting normal cultural and educational relations with foreign nations. The Moscow summer session was canceled in 1935 by the Russian authorities. I believed 20 years ago, and I believe today, that mature Americans can engage in conversation and controversy, the clash of ideas with communists anywhere in the world without becoming contaminated or converted. I believe that our faith, our conviction, our determination are stronger than theirs, and that we can compete and successfully, not only in the area of bombs, but in the area of ideals. Senator McCarthy couldn't even get my present relationship with CBS straight. He repeatedly referred to me as the educational director, a position I have not held for 17 years. The senator waved a copy of the Daily Worker, saying an article in it has praised me. Here is an example of what Senator McCarthy calls praise by William Z. Foster in the March 17 issue of the Daily Worker. Quote, during the past 10 days, Senator McCarthy has received a number of resounding belts in the jaw. These came from Adlai Stevenson, E.R. Murrow, Senator Flanders, the Army leadership, broadcasting companies. Even Eisenhower himself had to give McCarthy a slap on the wrist. That was the sole reference to me in Mr. Foster's article. Another charge by Senator McCarthy was that Owen Lattimore mentioned me in a book. What Lattimore said in substance was that he had never met me, but that I had done a fair job of reporting his testimony. In short, that I had not presumed his guilt. Everything I said on that case is a matter of record and can be examined by anyone who is interested. I hope to continue to present evidence developed before congressional committees as impartially as I am able, and that specifically includes the hearings before which Senator McCarthy is shortly scheduled to appear. I have worked for CBS for more than 19 years. The company has subscribed fully to my integrity and responsibility as a broadcaster and as a loyal American. I require no lectures from the junior senator from Wisconsin as to the dangers or terrors of communism. Having watched the aggressive forces at work in Western Europe, having had friends in Eastern Europe butchered and driven into exile, having broadcast from London in 1943 that the Russians were responsible for the Katyn massacre, having told the story of the Russian refusal to allow Allied aircraft to land on Russian fields after dropping supplies to those who rose in Warsaw and then were betrayed by the Russians, and having been denounced by the Russian radio for these reports, I cannot feel that I require instruction from the senator on the evils of communism. Having searched my conscience and my files, I cannot contend that I have always been right or wise, but I have attempted to pursue the truth with some diligence and to report it, even though, as in this case, I had been warned in advance that I would be subjected to the attentions of Senator McCarthy. We shall hope to deal with matters of more vital interest to the country next week. Good night and good luck.
Okay. So like I said, his response was just amazing with that how he targeted what McCarthy said, and the long list of things that he made up in that. So you have like his response, as well as his reaction in front of Congress, which kind of made him look crazy. And then just the constant refusal to actually provide a list of names all led to his downfall, but not before he had caused a lot of damage. He was destructive, not only, right, and he caused increase in anxiety and fear, for sure, suspicion of people in general and neighbors. He got people fired. Well, he didn't directly, had people fired. And, right, just just all around a really shitty guy. He was not nice. He was also supposedly a drunk. All of this eventually, like I said, he again slowly lost power, and people stopped believing him. Which, why they ever believed him in the first place? Only because of fear. I mean, he didn't actually provide any evidence at any time to back up what he is saying, and he just bullied people out of the spotlight, and no longer being listened to. He fell. He was supposedly an alcoholic already, but he fell back to alcohol, and died a few years later. But it certainly shows this, right, the hysteria, the fear, the uncertainty of the Cold War culture, and what people were willing to do. And not everyone, because there were protests, there was rejection of this, but what the government was willing to do, what people were willing to do because of that fear and this fictitious kind of sense of spies and everything else. Not that there weren't ever spies, but there was a lot of fictitious fear-mongering that took place. Okay, so we're going to end there because that leads perfectly into the 1950s and the suburban housewife and what we were talking about there. But let me just show you the last couple PowerPoint slides with like kind of how this seeped into culture. Here was Alger Hiss, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Here was their mugshots, and then you had the media, as I mentioned, that chronicled this whole thing, and they again weren't particularly nice to them. And again, until it was decided that they were going to be executed, that there was more public outcry. But then you have this propaganda, this fear-mongering, right? Is this tomorrow? Is what people being apparently raped and murdered by the communists while the United States is up in flames. I mean, it just showcases the level of craziness with fear. And they did this, they were indoctrinating kids from a very young age into this fear. You had atomic bomb drills where you drop, and cover. But the idea must be drop, tuck, and cover, that you hide under your desk. And they had drills, and they had these videos. I'll see if I can find it and put the link in for you. Where they showed these films to elementary school kids, where it talked about comparing a turtle and how they could hide in their shell to protect them. Likewise, you could hide under your desk like a turtle does a shell, like that was going to save you from an atomic bomb. But then they proceeded to talk about the destructive nature of the atomic bomb and how it destroys everything. And so these kids were being put into this fear of these constant drills, because you never knew when the commies were going to attack, or the Soviet Union was going to blow you up, and they talked about the kids too, that anyone could be spies, and you need to be a good, loyal American citizen. And so it instilled, and then again, with this type of propaganda, that this constant fear, so much so that family bomb shelters like this is an actual diagram of a family bomb shelter that you could purchase and have constructed in your home. Individual families were so concerned that the end was near and that that atomic bombs were going to be dropped, that many families who could afford it built these bomb shelters they dug them into their backyard. In their backyard, underground bomb shelters, with this fear that this was necessary, this was inevitable. I mean, I think that's what this shows, is that there was this direct fear that this was inevitable. And they had all these different designs. There was also movies that were made that talked about the horrible communist spies out to kill and destroy people. They had a board game that was created for avoid the atomic bombs. You had so much of this Cold War culture just get centered around this fear. So, okay, that's where we're going to end. And it kind of goes straight into that Cold War fear and how that perpetuates the idea of the suburban housewife and the conservative movement of the 1950s.